Alright, I've already talked about the game Final Fantasy VII, now time to talk about the movie Advent Children. Advent Children isn't the first Final Fantasy movie to be released. The first one was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within in 2001. Advent Children was released in 2005. The movie actually takes place 2 years after the events of the game. The counter between Holy and Meteor practically devastated the planet, and the large city controlled by Shinra, Midgar, was completely destroyed. Cloud became a delivery boy, and most of the people around the world had started to become infected with a strange disease called geostigma. Geostigma, I think, is kind of like a combination of lupus and leprosy. It causes discoloration of the skin. A orphan that Cloud and his friend Tifa were raising suffered from the disease, but Cloud secretly has it too, and he keeps his arm in a sort of sleeve, concealing where the infection is. The film portrays Cloud as still being a bit depressive after losing his friend Zack 5 or 7 years ago, before the events of Final Fantasy VII, and Aerith due to the events of Final Fantasy VII. But he needs to shape up and raise his sword again when a new villain approaches Kadaj, who is a pale-haired, androgynous-looking individual who is desperately trying to seek something called Mother, no matter the cost. Now, the overall things about this movie are pretty good. The effects are very, very good, very advanced for its time. It actually looks like some of the pre-rendered scenes that are common in most Japanese RPGs. The soundtrack is pretty good. They did remake the One Winged Angel theme music that was in the final boss battle in the actual game. I really like the movie because it has a great deal of depth, a great deal of symbolism. For instance, my favorite example for this is there's one scene where Cloud finds Tifa badly beaten up in this one church. He tries to lift her up, but suddenly his arm starts leaking some black goo. In effect, he's trying to help, and he wants to help, but he remembers why he doesn't want to help, because that he's infected. The combat in the movie is actually pretty good. It steps away from the whole classic Japanese RPG where you attack and wait to attack again on the next turn. Many of the characters do pull off limit breakers. Cloud ultimately does so. He pulls off Omni Slash in one scene. But still, the fighting mechanics are pretty good. However, there are some flaws about the film, and the major flaw is that it's not really the film for outsiders to view. So if you're involved in the Final Fantasy universe, you have barely any idea what's going on. For example, one scene that baffled me until I kind of understood why was there's a scene where Kadaj has rounded up all these children, and he's standing on the other side of a river. Then he walks into this river, and the river starts to turn black, and the children are drinking the black water, and they change somehow. The problem is they never exactly explain what this is. I think if you know the Final Fantasy universe, you would probably understand it, but I didn't. So that's the basic flaw in this. Unless you have played the game or understood the Final Fantasy franchise, you would barely understand it. The other flaw, I think, is what Square Enix put on itself for creating it. When you create a monster, sometimes you have to find a way to overcome it. And the problem is that because it's a beautifully pre-rendered CG film, more people are going to want to see more of that animation in the future. The combat mechanics are far away from the typical RPG, so people are want to see more of that from Final Fantasy. And in effect, they kind of did. Dirge's Cerberus, which takes place a year after Advent Children, kind of advanced on the whole combat mechanics, but there is some flaws. Vincent has barely any good actions. Sure, the gunplay is okay, but guns are very limited. Melee fighting is very limited. Jumping is limited. So yeah, quite a few options. I haven't played Crisis Core, which was supposed to be a prequel to the actual Final Fantasy VII game, which tells Zack's story. Zack being Cloud's old friend back in when he worked for Shinra. I think they did kind of change to make the mechanics more hand-to-hand fighting rather than the whole turn-based RPG, but eventually that kind of wore off over time because future games that Square Enix released, like, for example, The Last Remnant to Xbox 360, it seemed like a complete step backwards, back to the original Final Fantasy. I understand that they're trying their best to do something completely different, but sometimes it just seems that most of what Square Enix creates is, in effect, like Final Fantasy. So that's the difficult part of it. Overall, I would say this film is pretty good. The graphics are pretty good. Music's pretty good. The effects are pretty good. The only handicap to this is there's going to be a problem where you have to really understand what some of these things are. And if you do, you might want to check GameFAQs, because I know they have some little explanations about what happened, and kind of fill me in a little bit. I'm gonna explore some future films for films that have not been released but are like in the works. I will explain what I know so far from at least Wikipedia or whatnot, and then state my opinion to say, well, how is this going to be put together? So, I'll see you later, and I'll think about the next film I want to review.